Hi. Welcome, everyone.
Hi.
I think we can start our seminar today. First of all, I want to thank you, Professor Senem Aydin-Duzgit, for accepting our invitation for this talk today. And I want to also thank all our participants who have joined us today to discuss new challenges to European integration in the post-corona world. Very briefly, I want to present Senem Aydin-Duzgit. She's a professor of international relations at Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences of Sabanci University in Istanbul, and she's also senior scholar and research and academic affairs coordination at the Istanbul Policy Center. And very briefly, I'm a teaching fellow at University of Birmingham in the UK at Political Science and International Relations Department. I hope you are doing fine, Professor.
I'm doing well, thank you very much.
Thank you. I just want to start very briefly by explaining our title and our general outline of our talk today. So our title starts by new, but we will discuss if these challenges are new or not to the European integration. So since the creation of the European Economic Community and European Community, then the European Union, the integration is facing many challenges, many crises, enlargement processes, reform processes, and lately it was in a Eurozone crisis, a refugee crisis, rise of right-wing populist movements, populist parties, Brexit, and now the COVID-19 crisis as a big challenge to deal with. First of all, for the big number of deaths and the health system discrepancies and economic fallout. But maybe the most important thing that we also should discuss, it is the solidarity dimension of these challenges, and mainly the COVID-19 crisis. We may say that the health system is under national governments' competences. At European Union level, we cannot say that the health system is under European integration area. Nevertheless, it was shocking to see that Germany or France denied to send help to Italy when it asked for it. In an integration created with the spirit of cooperation, with the spirit of solidarity, peace promoting, it was a little bit shocking to see that the major partners, the major members of the EU did not want to go to help to Italy when it was hit by this pandemic. So this process would probably influence the skepticism both between members and also towards the EU. So it will probably influence the skepticism. It was probably influence the rise of right-wing populist discourses and also the EU reform process. And it can also foster a more differentiated Europe where integration is realized at multi-speed. So how we can interpret the influence of the COVID-19 dealing process on the future of European integration?
Okay, thank you very much, dear Aslihan. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. I mean, you've already made a very good introduction in the sense that the European Union has already been facing considerable challenges even before the coronavirus hit the EU. And now we're dealing with a situation, with a context in which some of the challenges or some of the weaknesses of the European Union are basically being accentuated, are being basically getting worse, worstly affected by the virus and its aftermath. So, I mean, you mentioned some of the issues, and obviously there are challenges and issues both relating to the domestic front, that is intra-European Union, and the politics of the EU and the pace of integration and prospects for further solidarity and coordination, etc., that we can all discuss. But there are also challenges on the foreign policy front that are becoming more and more acute every day, I think, and which already also became acute to some extent, or at least became visible to some extent, more visible than other times, maybe during especially the early days of the corona crisis. Now, if we start with the domestic front, and that's what I'm going to begin with, since your introduction touches upon that, I mean, there are various significant issues or maybe existential issues that the EU is dealing with right now at the domestic front. And I think the future of the Europe debate, which will be launched soon, I mean, you probably know that the future of Europe debate is being launched. It looks like it will be similar in some ways to the future of the Europe, not in terms of content, but in terms of structure, during the time when it was held during the convention for the European Union, you know, back in 2000, the early 2000s. And I remember those, obviously, thanks to my age, but, you know, and you and other participants might not remember that. But we're kind of familiar with that kind of international future of Europe debate, and it looks like a new one will be held very soon. And I believe that many of those issues at the domestic front and the foreign policy front, which I'm also going to touch upon, will be somehow dealt with or discussed within the context of the overall future of Europe debate. Now, on the domestic front, there are a number of issues that need attending to. Now, on the one hand, you have this issue that has to do with rising illiberalism within the European Union, especially in Eastern Europe, but also in terms of the growth of right-wing parties in some of the core founding EU member states as well. This is a major issue, and I think this will have to be dealt with somehow. But of course, it's not an easy issue to deal with, as you know, we can talk more about it. The reasons or the drivers of these the growth of these illiberal movements are various. And some of those have to do with the European Union itself, right? I mean, for instance, if you want to understand and explain why Orban in Hungary has been in power for so long, or why he's able to do whatever he's been able to do for all this time, is partly has to do with the way in which the European Union, not intentionally maybe, has been empowering him and has been empowering his role. I mean, this has been taken up in academic circles a lot. Recently, Daniel Kellerman wrote about it. I do suggest, if anybody is interested in this, that you go ahead and read his piece. I think it was published in a special issue of Journal of European Public Policy, JEP, where he mentions an authoritarian equilibrium for political parties like Orban's. There are certain measures, he argues, that it emboldens and empowers these movements and helps them to stay in power, that are in fact made possible by the European Union as an institution. He, for instance, talks about something called, he talks about the European Parliament, for instance, right? And how these parliamentary groups are set up, and why, you know, none of the sort of major, core member state groups in the EPP, to which Orban's party belongs to, does not even dare kick Orban out, right? Because, you know, they don't want to basically weaken the voting weight of the bloc of that political group, for instance, right? And this creates a difficult kind of situation in the sense that, because, I mean, this is basically an end result of the fact that the European Parliament is not really 100% politicized like you have in parliaments of nation states, but that it's also not 100% non-politicized. So it's a semi-baked, as he calls, kind of institution in the degree of politicization, and that leads to, and this leads to a situation in which a political party like Orban's can benefit from. And of course, there's the issue of money, right? So EU money makes it to these governments where they basically hold increasingly the power to delegate it in the way in which they see fit, right? With, for instance, untransparent ways of delivering it, such as through competition, public procurement, etc., etc. So it helps them to basically appease their supporters or feed into their political groups or economic groups and constituencies in society. And again, helps to keep them in power. And a third way, of course, is through migration, right? I mean, especially one of the reasons why we see these movements come into power in Eastern Europe is because there's been so much migration from the East and the West after these countries became full members. And the argument is that they're losing their sort of intellectual manpower or women power to other European capitals, and they're left with basically the supporters of these authoritarian far-right regimes. So this is sort of, in my opinion, a pretty good explanation of why we're seeing what we're seeing, and which goes to show that this is not just a national issue, it's also a European issue, it's also an EU-wide issue that needs to be tackled. Now, a second issue, I think, which you've also mentioned in your introduction, has to do with disillusionment of citizens. Now, this is a major issue and it's not new. Obviously, we've had this, I mean, we're talking about the European Union, which has experienced crisis after crisis in the recent decade or so. We've had the Euro crisis, we've had the migration crisis, we've had Brexit, etc., and most recently, we've had the Corona crisis. And I think what each crisis is doing is, in some ways, it's leading to the rise of the European nation states in EU integration. So we hear more and more about nation state positions becoming very determinant on what Europe does and how it operates. So the nation states, I mean, the more you have crises, the more you see intergovernmentalism and the more you see nation states coming to the fore. And it's so much so that in some cases, national divisions even seem to trump ideological divisions, which sometimes seem to be more prominent in the previous decade. So this also is becoming an issue. And this disillusionment, I mean, this recently, I'm not sure if you've read it, but there's a very recent European-wide survey that has been conducted by the ECFR. And yeah, Ivan Krastev and his colleagues wrote a report on that. And I think that's a good study in the sense that you see that the public opinion is also very disillusioned after the Corona crisis. Publics from various different EU nation states feel like the European Union hasn't done enough, and then there should have been more solidarity, etc., etc. So, but what they also find, and maybe we can call it some kind of silver lining in all this discussion, is that people do not, at least after the Corona crisis, this disillusionment does not seem to have translated into further support for far-right populist parties in the European Union. And what they find is that it has translated into more vocal calls for further cooperation and further coordination between the European Union member states. And that's basically a call from the publics for more meaningful integration, in other words, right? So however that is going to be achieved is another question. But how this might be achieved, obviously, is something that will most probably be taken up on the Future of Europe debate, which will be held at some point. And I think there you have three issues that are related to one another that will have to be tackled. The first one is, I mean, the European Union has to somehow make a choice of going towards one out of two directions. One is whether or not you go along the direction of achieving more meaningful integration in the way of longer-term solidarity, where national state capacity may also be strengthened as a result of that. So one of the reasons why people seem to be so disillusioned with the EU as it is because, again, when you go back to ECFR survey, you see that they're disillusioned with the state capacity, with their state's way of delivery, for instance, during the coronavirus, as in other crisis situations. And there, I think one needs to remember the link between the strengthening of state capacity and European Union integration. Because if you go back to the literature, if we go back to the origins, if we go back to the readings, of economic historians like Alan Milward and others, all that argument was about how the European Union helped to restore European state capacity after the end of the Second World War. And I think this is important to see that, there is a call and a wish to see the European Union doing the same, to also help increase national state capacity in dealing with crisis situations. Because if you look at it at the end of the day, many of the issues that are seen as crisis for the EU are in fact all national policy areas. So when you look at, for instance, migration, asylum, that is 100% national policy area. If you look at the health system, which is being contested with coronavirus, that also is a national policy area, right? So these all are, super related to how the nation states are responding to it, because they are the first course of at least place of response, and they're not delivering. So I think it's that needs to be kept in mind. The other way through which the EU can go to, and I know these are maybe two ideal type extremes, but whether or not it will go towards a more inward-looking economic union among independent, more sovereign kind of member states, just the common single market, economic union, devoid of values and and devoid of further integration in political matters. Now, that also is obviously a possibility. And of course, this is also the kind of union that many sort of far-right populist movements or illiberal movements would also prefer to see. Now, and related to that, of course, these two visions, you have the question of burden sharing, right? This issue of burden sharing keeps on coming up and up after every single crisis. After the Euro crisis, when the fiscal compact was being negotiated, the core of the debate was again, who's going to share the burden, right?
Yeah.
Will the North share the burden of the South, and the conditions under which this will be made? And at the time, it was agreed that austerity was going to be the rule of the game, right? Or for instance, in the migration crisis, the whole debate was about burden sharing. The only reason that the European Union agreed to the EU-Turkey migration deal with Turkey was because there was absolutely no burden sharing among the EU member states, and because the European Union does not have an asylum policy. It seemed to be easier to sign the statement, the deal with Turkey, than come up with a common asylum policy. That is the reason why the deal as we know it today exists. The same with the post-corona context. Although not a post-corona because we're still dealing with the disease, but still, in terms of, whether the North will share a certain degree of their burden for what the South had been going through. And I'm sure you've seen the discussions there about some key Northern Europe countries like, Austria or Holland, et cetera, who are having serious difficulties with financing, and that's why, for instance, the Corona bonds was out of question, et cetera. But of course, there the dilemma is that, obviously, in the eyes of the taxpayers, this might be very difficult to sell politically in the North. But on the other hand, you'll have to keep in mind that without the South consuming whatever the North is producing, the North will ultimately be affected by the recession in the South as well. So there is this kind of very close transnational connection, which in fact does require solidarity, but in a short-term political game, which politics is, it's very difficult to sell and to argue for that. But in my opinion, it's still important to see that and to carry that. So this is more of the internal workings that we can, discuss more when you ask questions or if you have comments, etc., that I can come back to. So in the domestic front, these are the sort of, in my opinion, the very big hot potatoes, very big issues that that's been existing for a long time now. They're not new. They're just becoming more visible and more acute as Europe is crippled with crisis after crisis. Now, on the foreign policy front, which of course, obviously very difficult to completely disentangle the foreign policy front from the domestic front. But on the foreign policy front, One important question is how can Europe ever increase its influence or exercise its influence in the geopolitical competition with players like China and the United States, right? Yeah. Which it's growing more and more estranged from. This is an important question, and this is a question in which, you know, immediate answers are not very optimistic, at least. I mean, there's a lot of talk about, you know, strategic autonomy for Europe, all these calls for strategic autonomy, but how this is going to be achieved, in my opinion, remains completely blank. So there are some propositions out there, but whether or not they're feasible or achievable is a different question. The big sort of elephant in the room is what would happen, let's say, if Trump is re-elected to power in America, which obviously is a serious possibility, right? How will relations between Europe and US, how will they further deteriorate? I mean, obviously, they're not going to improve. They can only get worse, in my opinion, if Trump is re-elected. But what will Europe choose to do about it is another question. Now, there's, of course, an issue with China. I mean, just before the corona crisis, you know, again, there's always this contention within Europe on whether Europe should be more assertive with China or just try to be a bit more balanced. And but I think, especially after the corona crisis, it was seen that, you know, that Europe might have to be a little bit more assertive than it was. Yeah. You know, economically, if not geopolitically, I mean, if not in pure foreign policy terms, in economic terms. In terms of production, etc., as of key products, you know, health-related products, sanitation products, etc. And from there on, I think there might be a more assertive policy building up. It remains to be seen, but this is something that needs to be discussed. Again, the issue of defense cooperation or further defense cooperation. I mean, you see Macron popping up every one day or two, you know, whatever something goes wrong, you know, blames it on NATO being brain dead. He said it just a few days ago when he was disillusioned with Turkey and Libya. So he's getting annoyed and he says, okay, everything is a testament to NATO being brain dead, which is fine and good, maybe from a French perspective, but what do you do about it, right? I mean, what's the alternative? The alternative is very difficult within the European Union. First of all, for many reasons, one of the primary reasons being the fact that Central and Eastern European countries, they're not going to do anything other than NATO, at least for the foreseeable future, right? They see for their security NATO membership as an integral part of their own self, given their perceptions of Russia. And they know and they feel that whatever Europe comes up with, it's going to be definitely much less pronounced than what's already been established in NATO there. So there's going to be the Central and Eastern European objection, or at least issue, right, that would somehow have to be appeased or somehow have to be satisfied. There's also the Germany question. I mean, France keeps on making these calls, but then for this to happen, I mean, for, let's say, you know, they came up with PESCO initiative, but obviously PESCO is very weak as it stands, right? And why is it weak? Because it has been subject to the major clash between France and Germany on these foreign and security policy issues. Because France wants to keep it limited, but more powerful and assertive, with the inclusion of those who can really contribute the most. Whereas Germany wants to keep it as wide as possible with the inclusion of every other European, you know, member state as those who wants to be a part of it. And that kind of, that kind of division is, I think, at the core of PESCO, and that's what it's making it weak. But that's also very symptomatic or emblematic of why it's so difficult for France to have some kind of a strategically autonomous Europe from NATO in the area of security and defense, without Germany, you know, without the Germans having a sort of a similar vision. And well, I mean, whether the Germans will change track or course after, let's say, assuming that Trump is re-elected, is a big question. We don't know. I mean, we'll have to, because there are some, you know, who say that Germany might change its position after if Trump is re-elected, because then it will have no choice but to, you know, pull its weight behind more integrated and more assertive security and defense policy on the part of Europe. There's a lot of talk about the establishment for a European Security Council, similar to the UN Security Council. You know, some argue that that would also be a good way of keeping Britain in the loop, you know, since it's now out of all these initiatives after Brexit. It's argued that Britain is an important partner in foreign and security issues. So if we come up with a European Security Council, we'll have Britain on board. But I mean, these are all kind of, I mean, cheap talk as of now. So whether or not they're possible, so whether or not, even if they're enabled and somehow operational, whether or not they would really have an effect is a big question, because obviously, I mean, as long as you have unanimity, etc., in this decision making in this area, it's very, very difficult to really come up with a common position, seeing differences that exist between the nation states. And finally, again, on a foreign policy matter, but I think, you know, closely related to domestic politics, is also this issue of Europe's normative power, which has basically been under attack, you know, both because of the rise of illiberalism within Europe, erosion of democracies inside Europe, but also the fact that we're living in a very geopolitical world. I mean, when the coronavirus first sort of, you know, came out in the first initial weeks, we were thinking, well, you know, maybe we might be witnessing the end, or at least the suspension of geopolitics for a while. But now I'm not so certain. You know, I have increasing doubts, because you see what's happening in Libya, and soon, you know, we're going to be seeing more of that perhaps in Syria, and that's not the case. And on top of that, what we see is that actors like China, they immediately creep in, playing the normative game whenever they feel like the European Union is failing, which is what they did in Italy, for instance, right? Again, in the survey I was mentioning at the beginning, when Italians were asked who they think, you know, that helped them the most in the darkest days of the corona crisis, around, I don't know, majority or so said China, and a very little percentage said the European Union. So this is what I mean by the normative game when it's being played. So the EU is not the only normative actor as such. So the normativity of the others might be questioned, but still, you know, if so, they can also play the normative card when they feel like there is an opportunity there. So yeah, I mean, I think I'll stop at that, just to give you a broad outline of where I see the major fault lines and problems lying. So now I can try to answer your questions and comments.
Okay, thank you very much for this huge amount of information in your presentation. So maybe I have questions, but maybe if we can go back to the institutional problems very briefly for the EU, the intergovernmentalism and supranationalism debates among the European Union. So we know that EU structure is not dotted by urgent decision-making capability. Each crisis is, if each crisis is dealt by the EU, it took 2-3 years usually. So there is no urgent crisis management capability of the EU, but now we are in a situation where the EU needs this kind of capability. So the effectivity of EU institutions are questions, the efficiency of EU institutions are questioned, but at the same time, as you have said, the national governments gain more and more power at domestic level. So some supranational reforms are needed for the EU to become a real actor in international relations, and also an important figure also for the member states, for the EU citizens. So usually we see that national governments of member states have the tendency to blame EU institutions when things do not go the way they wish for. So nation governments do not prefer to have strong supranational institutions in front of them. But at the same time, some members like France want to see a powerful European Union, a powerful European integration. So what we can expect from this crisis to lead the European integration in terms of institutional dimension? Can we anticipate more powerful institutions for the EU, or should we anticipate for more powerful national governments to become more effective, more influential in EU's policies?
Well, you mentioned two things there, so I'm going to, I want to touch upon them both. The first one about the citizens. Now, yes, the citizens are, well, at least the studies suggest that citizens are disillusioned with the European Union, but when you're interpreting the results of those studies, you have to keep in mind that people know, normal, ordinary people know very little about the EU in terms of how it functions, who makes decisions, in which policy area the European Union has any competence. I mean, this is all unclear to most people, most EU citizens themselves. So, for instance, when the coronavirus hits and their nation state or health system cannot cope with it, they don't really know whether or not it's the EU or the nation state or who to blame. So the EU is easily seen as the culprit, right? So not everybody has knowledge about the fact that health is a national policy priority, policy area. And that goes for other things as well, like, as I said, migration crisis, right? Asylum. It's because there is no coordination, right? And there is no integration. That's why it's happening. So in terms of people's views of who is responsible or not, I mean, we've seen it in Brexit as well, that doesn't always take place on a rational, fully informed public sphere, because that really doesn't really exist. So that needs to be kept in mind when we're trying to make sense of the public reactions to some of these policies. Now, the second and related point which you mentioned, obviously, that about institutional change. Now, if we're going to talk about institutional change, then we'd have to consider treaty change, right?
Yeah.
So if you want, let's say, if you want to introduce QMV, let's assume qualified majority voting in the area of foreign and security policy, you would need a treaty change where you would have to go through, again, unanimous agreement of the member states. I see that very difficult. I don't see that happening in the foreseeable future. I think the EU is right now politically, economically, especially given the fact that we are in the wake of a major economic recession, which we haven't yet started to feel the effects of. I mean, not just in Turkey, but Europe and elsewhere. So at such a sensitive point in time, I cannot see the European Union doing any treaty changes. So I don't see any realistic possibility of the introduction of QMV in politically sensitive areas like foreign policy, for instance, right, where the EU needs to be more assertive. Or even in issues like health. I mean, maybe we might see some more integration in that respect. That might have to do with perhaps the production of health-related goods, right? So that would again be maybe in the context of the single market and economic policies, rather than the integration of health system and hospitals and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
See what I mean? So in my opinion, yes, of course, there'll be some new measures. But I think they will be undertaken in the context of and under the prevailing institutions and policymaking mechanisms. I don't see any major treaty change that will make a fundamental shift, at least in the foreseeable future. Of course, I might be wrong, but at least that's my feeling or reading of it.
Yeah. And if we talk about again the burden sharing and cleavages between North and South among members of the EU. So, so these times, because of the pandemic, we can say that since the creation of the European integration, it is the maybe it is most hit economically since its very foundation, or even since the Great Depression, maybe. So last week, the EU presidents and prime ministers met to discuss an EU recovery fund to respond to the corona crisis and the EU long-term budget for 2020. And the Commission proposed a stimulus plan. So these are economic matters in nature, but these are also political milestones in the history of EU integration. We have cleavages that are emerging. How this fund will be divided among EU members. There are members like Italy and Spain that favors grants, for example, whereas Netherlands, Finland, Denmark, and Austria prefers loans. And the gap between North and South members seem to be growing. So considering past crises and response of the EU, the economic aspect of this crisis, what should we expect from EU members and what should we expect from France and Germany as the traditional motors of the European integration, we can say?
Okay, well, I mean, so far we have been rather sort of critical of the EU in some ways, you know, pointed at the problems, but I don't think we should underestimate the economic measures that are also being undertaken right now under the Commission. I think the economic, at least the package, is quite bold. It's quite immense. And in that sense, I think we should give it credit where it's due. That's what I think. But we also have to be careful in interpreting this. I mean, it's yes, this economic plan, this whole package is important, and in some ways it's also very different than before, right? Because of the system, because of the structure of it. But it also is something that it's not going to translate in any kind of fiscal union, right? So that's where the buck stops. So I think that's something that we need to see. So in terms of the transformative effect of all this on the EU, I think what's being done in terms of the economic package is important. And I think it will be significant. But it's not something that will lead to any kind of further institutional transformation. I don't see a fiscal union happening, right? Just like I don't see a Europe where state will be more and more involved, because these were two things that were, you know, speculated about, especially in the early days of the coronavirus pandemic, that whether the EU will now go towards a fiscal union and whether we're going to be seeing more of the state and health sector and other sectors. I have doubts about both, right? So I don't think that's what we're going to see. But having said all that, the package is a significant one. I think it will make a huge difference, especially in the South. So I think it's important. And not just, I mean, it's not just the domestic economic package, but also the external package is also pretty strong as well, right? When you look at the Team Europe initiative, when you look at how much money is being scaled into Western Balkans and Eastern Europe, you will see that it exceeds by far the money that's been given by Russia, right? So yes, so that also needs to be considered in terms of the sort of financial commitment or economic commitment to Europe, not just inside but also outside in its immediate neighborhood.
Thank you very much. We started to receive questions from our audience, but I have two other points to ask you, if I may. About Brexit, which was subject to long debates, the transition period will be completed in December 2020, and the trade negotiations between the UK and the EU still continue. So the UK was the less integrated member state to the EU. The UK opt-outs were prominent while EU was trying to decide on some policies. So the concessions made did not remove political obstacles and may have actively encouraged further special treatment example for other member states. So could we label Brexit as the failure of European integration due to too much differentiation, or is it an opportunity for the reform process of the EU integration? How you interpret Brexit and European integration relationship?
Well, I think Brexit tells us more about the UK than it tells us about the EU. That's what I think.
Yeah.
So yes, and in a very sad way as well, because Brexit is a blunder of a Cameron administration back in the day, trying to appease his backbenchers from the Conservative Party and thinking that he could just get away with this. So it was a political blunder. It was an existential, I think, mistake, and they live with it. And all of the Brexit campaign as well, on how it was fought on identity issues, on migrants, on massive false information, misinformation, whatever you'd like to call it, tells you a lot about British political landscape. And we know that Britain was susceptible to kind of, misinformation and landscape already, given the high Eurosceptic tendencies that traditionally existed among the British electorate. So that's also something not very new. So in my opinion, in all these senses, I think it tells us more about Britain than it tells us about the EU. And I really think it's more a Britain problem, a British problem, than a European problem. And obviously it would have been good for Europe to have Britain on board. It's an important global player. Obviously it's an important economic market, a financial center in London, and all this and that. So it's sad, but in my opinion, it tells less about the EU's failure than the failure of British politics, administration, and governance. But that's you asked my personal interpretation of it. That's how I interpret it, because I think Britain has not started to really suffer or, at least experience the consequences of Brexit yet. They started, during the Corona crisis, for instance, when they realized that they had nobody to crop their agricultural farms and things, and they realized how, they're still dependent on migration from within Europe, Central and Eastern Europe, etc. So in many respects, I think they will begin to feel that even more so in the coming years. So I think that's still early to say. But something else. Oh, hold on. I was going to say something else about Britain. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. I'll come back to it when I remember it. There was something else, and I didn't write it down as you were speaking, Bob. So I'm going to mention that anyway.
Okay.
But that's how I interpret the Brexit. Oh yeah. Okay, I remember now.
Okay.
And I also don't think that Brexit. I think what also happened is that because Brexit was such a big political blunder, and because it took ages to resolve, and it's not even fully resolved even today.
Yeah.
I think would make any EU member state very reluctant to go down that road again. So the fear that was expressed in the early discussions of Brexit, whether or not this would have some kind of a domino power effect on the rest of the European countries, that I am not so sure of. Because first of all, they saw that they are rather powerless when the European Union, stands a united front against the country that's leaving, so that you cannot leave on your own terms. That just doesn't exist.
Exactly.
And if you insist, this is just going to drag and take forever. And so in my opinion, it's sort of, so whether or not it would create any precedent, I think it probably has the effect of, the opposite effect of diminishing, or at least weakening the incentive to leave.
Yeah. Thank you. So my last question will be about the Black Lives Matter protests in the USA, and also that happened in some of European capitals. So these were protests. Wave started with the killing of George Floyd by a policeman in the USA. So what I want to ask is, the the president in the USA, Trump, threatened the population of using violence against them. But the EU, which was usually labeled as a normative power, as a power that was looking after human rights, rule of law, democratic principles, etc., did not react against this discourse as a European Union. But it does not remain silent in similar situations normally. So what does it tell us about the European Union position against call for violence, or also its position against racism, considering the authoritarian inclinations in Poland or in Hungary, for example, considering right-wing populism rising in some of the European members. So I did not see any concrete, clear reaction against Trump's violent discourse against US population. So how we can analyze this? What does it tell us about European Union integration?
Well, I mean, here I think I would have to speculate a bit because I haven't seen any studies or anything on this, since also it's very new.
Yeah.
So I'll just express what I personally feel or think about it. So take it from an ordinary professor who hasn't done any work on this. I would say that there are multiple factors, I think, at work here. One is I don't think European states would feel very comfortable on commenting on this.
Yeah.
Because the race question in the United States is a rather different one than, I mean, I'm not saying that Europe doesn't suffer from racism, don't get me wrong. But the nature of the race problem in the US is a rather different one, and it has a different type of history than it does in Europe, in many European states. So I think there's a major difference between the way in which the United States has been experiencing this in terms of the polarized divide between the black and the white races, and the whole political and sociological and historical dimensions of it are in many ways very US centric. So that sort of reluctance to be vocal about this, to some extent, I think stems from this. Another reason could be that, well, yes, Europe maybe doesn't suffer from a racism problem as, you know, in the same nature as the US does, but it does suffer from racism in different ways. Like, for instance, all these sort of anti-refugee sentiments or anti-migrant sentiments or discourses. I mean, if you look at the work of discourse scholars, for instance, in sociology, in IR, who work with these issues, they find that much of that rhetoric is ultimately very racist. And furthermore, they find that that racist discourse, which was, you know, initially articulated, mostly at least, by far-right populist movements, have now been co-opted into the discourse of the center-right, more mainstream center-right political parties. So it's becoming more and more mainstream. So that goes to show that there is also a sort of a very mainstream right now race problem in the EU as well, but just on different terms, right? On the basis of cultural difference, on the basis of, you know, migrants and, you know, us and them, and all kinds of different kinds of arguments. So it's a different one in terms of nature, history, articulation, discourse, whatever, than the US, but it doesn't mean that that Europe is not suffering from it. It is.
Yeah.
So I think we have to make sure we have to put out the nuances and that we're dealing with different things. And thirdly, well, there were some very strong voices still from Europe, I think, to whatever was happening in the US. I mean, maybe not so always from the governments, but there were, you know, societal demonstrations. I mean, I remember the one in Holland, for instance, that was massive. So that goes to show that perhaps we should also be looking at the societal attitudes here. And maybe when we're talking about polarization in countries like US, for instance, or polarization in Turkey, for instance, or elsewhere, I mean, we also see that in many places in Europe today, a value-based polarization between those who are in favor of a more sort of an open Europe, outward-looking Europe, value-wise, a much more cosmopolitan Europe, fine with racial difference, cultural difference, etc., and those who are much more inward-looking and much more hostile towards, migrants and this and that, etc. So in that sense, you see arguments, those who are, very vocal against these things also happening in the US or in Turkey or elsewhere, right? So you have these kind of more transnational societal alliances that is now taking place. So we shouldn't just look at how the governments reacted or didn't react, but also we should see how the societies feel about that. And when we look at that, we see similar sort of divides that exist in Europe as well.
Yeah. So my questions have come to an end now. I will try to ask you the questions from our audience. So the first question would be about France's foreign policy, and mainly about the need to establish strategic dialogue with Russia. So our participant is asking if France's unilateral attitude towards Putin's Russia would pose a threat to EU's unity, or is it something that the EU is needing?
Well, I don't think that the majority of the European Union would agree with that kind of stance. Central and Eastern European countries would be against it, full stop, as a whole bloc. And I would say that Germany would also be hesitant towards it, and many others. So I don't really see France having much of an alliance or gathering much of an alliance within Europe for closer cozying up to relations with Russia. That seems to be a very much French position to me. And I don't think that it's very plausible as well, given Russia's own assertiveness in European back garden, in the European geopolitical space, in how it's working to discredit Europe, and both in Eastern neighborhood, but also in the Southern neighborhood. And I think Macron voices this from time to time as he gets more and more disillusioned in places like Libya, right? Where he feels like he needs to close up with Russia. Now, I think that's a typical and age-long French policy of externalizing its own foreign policy priorities onto the EU agenda, but I'm not sure he's going to find a lot of partners in that respect.
Another question is about the relations between Europe and China after the COVID-19 crisis. How do you see Europe ties with China would be evaluated? Our participant is asking.
You mean how the EU-China relations will change, or?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the EU is finding it difficult to tread a fine balance or a fine line in terms of relations with China. Because on the one hand, there is an economic relationship which some member states than others are more reliant on. I mean, we know, for instance, that China's Belt and Road Initiative will already go through, and already there's been signed agreements between China and countries like Italy, right, and some others. So China plays a good game of divide and rule within the European Union when it comes to the Belt and Road Initiative, but other economic initiatives as well. So because of that, there are certain countries which want the EU to be much more sort of careful or balanced with China. But obviously, on the other hand, there is also this question that the coronavirus has exposed, which is what happens when all the sort of production of your key goods, or medicine, medication, etc., and everything is produced in China. So the idea is that wouldn't it be better for the safety of the EU as such, for those goods to be produced somewhere much closer to Europe? It might be costlier, in financial terms maybe, but in terms of access in crises, etc. So the proximity of supply, for instance, is discussed. So I think on that respect, we might expect more developments in terms of securing supply, because I mean, coronavirus has also exposed how dependent a huge economic market like the European Union might be in these situations on an actor like China. But on the political issues, like for instance, the Taiwanese question, or on Uyghur, etc., minority, and how the Chinese treat them, I can't see the European Union taking a more assertive stance than it already has. So I don't see much change there.
Mm-hmm. Another question is related to the production and supply chains. I can say so. If food, the supply chain was disrupted when the coronavirus crisis started. Now it seems like it is more or less dealt with, but with the second wave that is expected, there is a problem of seeing some food production disruption, or some health and PPE production supply problem. So do you think that China would be an important partner to resolve this supply chain problem for the EU?
Well, I don't think so, because I think it is the problem rather than the solution. The fact that there is just too much dependence on China is what's creating the problem. And it's just too far away, and it's just very difficult to rely on. And whether or not you want to be so reliant on it is another problem, given its aggressiveness, overall, to have further and further influence in Europe. And Europe was also having major problems with China about competition policy. And its stance on the Hawaii case is, for instance, well known, and it always complains that it cannot really enter into the Chinese market because of the Chinese hurdles of this and that. And those issues existed before the coronavirus, and I don't think they're going to disappear just like that after the coronavirus. They're still here to settle.
So we are coming to the end of our seminar, but I have one question from our audience, which is related to the EU's enlargement policy in the post-corona period. Will the EU prioritize differentiated integration or not? He's asking for your opinion.
Yeah, well, differentiated integration has already been here for a very long time, and it's not going anywhere. And I think that's going to continue as is. But on top of that, I think they will proceed with enlargement to the Western Balkans. I think that's still on the agenda of the European Union, and I think the European Union is serious about that. And I do think that the enlargement with Western Balkans, the policy of enlargement with Western Balkans will continue. It will take some time, and we know that enlargement rules are now even stricter with the recent changes that have been made to negotiation rules, etc., that were pushed by France. So the EU will have to be even more convinced that these countries are ready by the time comes. But I think the overall policy agenda is not going to change, and I think the European Union will continue with enlargement. But obviously, it will, I think, will be much more careful in who is going to be a part of which policy area, etc., when the time comes. So in terms of differentiated integration, the trends towards differentiation, both internal and external differentiation, I think will continue. Even when they become a member.
So sorry, but the questions are coming. So lastly, maybe I can ask the question of Nathan, who is asking if the pandemic will provide further opportunities of trade and cooperation in the EU neighborhood.
I do think that, actually. I do think that. And there's even some discussion about whether even Turkey could benefit from this situation, since it's close to the EU. Hi, Başak. I'm seeing the chat box.
Sorry, Senemciğim, I'm using my husband's, account. It just logged in automatically. So
I don't know he was your husband. That's okay.
You might be thinking.
That's all right. Hi, nice to hear from you.
I was quite like my question was mostly about like it looks like related to the supply chain management, like the general problem with that. I was just wondering if it is going to be providing an opportunity for the EU to focus finally on the neighborhood more properly. So I was just wondering about your opinion on that.
Well, there is an opportunity and they might turn in that direction. As I said, it's possible. I think it's possible the more they realize also that they need to keep it closer to home. But how much of it can they actually do? Like how much of it would be feasible is another question that I don't know.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, both of you. So thank you very much for joining us today, Professor. And thank you very much for joining us, our audience, and for your questions. It was really nice to meet you all today, and it was really nice to hear your comments and the information you provided, Professor. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you soon.
Well, thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure. Thank you for the questions and for listening. Thanks very much. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Have a lovely Sunday. So see you soon, everyone.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.